Chairman Martin, Senator Savino, good morning. My name is Hank Kita, Executive Director of the Subcontractors Trade Association of New York City, otherwise known as the STA. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you on the important issue of prompt payment to construction contractors and subcontractors in New York. The STA has over 300 union subcontractors in its organization and 350 members in total. In its day-to-day activities, the STA represents its members in dealing with the public agencies, authorities, and private developers in New York City. The STA's philosophy centers on dispute resolution without the need for litigation, and the association has served its members well in this regard. Personally, I spend a significant amount of time trying to resolve payment issues for our members on both private and public construction projects, so I appreciate your efforts in addressing this very real problem today. As you just noted, I have several war stories, so to speak, relating to this issue that I'd like to share as I get into my testimony. In one instance, a large subcontractor, a prominent member actually of my association working in the energy field, has been attempting to recover millions of dollars from a public agency for work that has been substantially completed for over 5 years at a power plant. The public agency in question has continued to force the subcontractor to maintain equipment that is installed on what is being called legacy projects. This particular public agency has projects that extend for years and years and years, consequently the use of the term legacy projects. After many years of trying to close the project out and receive final payment for work done, this particular subcontractor is attempting to now close the project out and recover its money by appealing to the Comptroller's Office, a process that was just described by Peter from the Electrical Contractors Association. Unfortunately, there does not appear to be an end in sight to this matter, and this situation is obviously causing a great deal of stress to the subcontractor's financial situation. Another example, and this is one that I've been dealing with over the last couple of weeks, a very poignant one given the size of the subcontractor and the position that they are currently in. A small minority women business enterprise, actually this is both an MW in that regard, working for a public agency, in a public agency mentor-protege program, is in the process of going out of business because of the failure of the agency to allot sufficient funds for change orders on a particular project. The MWBE was forced to complete the change order work per the public contract, but was told that there was not enough money appropriated for the project to pay them. Consequently, the MWBE has had to shutter its doors and lay off its workers. This MWBE is in the process of retaining legal counsel to file a lawsuit against the agency and the general contractor running the project. In the end, though, they're out of business at this particular point. Yet one more example. Another subcontractor working on a public agency education construction project is out several $100,000 because of the unwillingness of the public agency to pay in full for change order work that the contractor is obligated to perform. Per the processes laid out earlier by Mr. Hogan. According to the subcontractor, the project architect's design was deficient and faulty, leading to the need for a slew of project change orders. The agency's staff have tried to negotiate down the cost of the change order work to cents on the dollar in order to come within their budget, with no allowance or consideration made for the deficiency of the design. In other words, the contractor is being asked to pay the price for the agency's chosen design team's failures. This particular subcontractor is, as the others I just mentioned, suffering a severe financial crisis as a result of the public agency's failure to meet its change order payment obligations. But for time constraints today, I could relate other horror stories on subcontractors being put in untenable financial positions by public and private entities, treating the subcontractor as a bank for projects when it comes time to pay in full for services rendered. This is the reality of public and at times private construction work in New York. Subcontractors who work hard to win a bid and complete work in a timely fashion must wait and wait and wait to get paid, if they get paid at all. And when they do, the subcontractor must often settle on receiving a fraction of what's due them. These scenarios do beg the question, could any of you, any of us, successfully grow a business or even decide to keep your business in New York under such challenging circumstances? Frankly, many subcontractors can't or won't. Construction businesses will close because a second generation of ownership has no interest in continuing to operate in New York, or a subcontractor will maintain a presence in New York but grow its business in another state with a more friendly business climate. Or a highly regarded subcontractor who produces quality work will avoid bidding on public works projects altogether because he or she doesn't need the expected hassle when it comes to properly getting paid. Or project bids will have a premium built in to compensate the subcontractor for anticipated future payment problems. All of this is real, and it's happening right now. In spite of the dire scenario that I've just related to you on this issue of subcontractor payment, I'm happy to say that there are presently many positive bills pending in the State Senate that address the problem of prompt payment, as well as other related issues. And I thank you, Senator Martins, and many other senators for introducing them. I won't comment extensively on any of them at this time, and you've heard from previous speakers about several of these, other than to say that these bills attempt to tackle many of the problems that are confronting construction subcontractors in New York, that they will improve the situation and make New York a much more competitive place to do business. Just to summarize these proposals that we're certainly in favor of, S7613, 7615, and 7264, all introduced by Senator Martins, which reform the state's public and private prompt pay laws. S6582, originally introduced by the late Senator Libous and now Senator Hannan, which would allow contractors and subcontractors to seek appropriate compensation for delay damages when a project delay resulting in increased costs is not the contractor or subcontractor's fault. S37, S2924, and 6315, all introduced by Senator DeFrancisco, which address and reform the state's antiquated retainage laws, which could be a worthy topic for an entire hearing all of its own. These bills call for the release of retainage, the payment of interest on retainage, or clarification of the term substantial completion, which all boils down to the same thing, helping subcontractors get paid faster for the work they do. S6906, introduced by Senator Ranzenhofer, and a bill which is near and dear to the STA's heart, in that we've done a lot of hard work in trying to push this proposal forward. Which prohibits the inclusion of time-sensitive notice provisions in public works contracts that can result in the complete forfeiture of a contractor or subcontractor's valuable rights to a claim under a public construction contract. S6906 simply says that unless a public agency can show prejudice or material harm as a result of a contractor or subcontractor failing strictly to comply with a notice provision in a public works contract, the public agency cannot declare a complete forfeiture of the contractor or subcontractor's claim. Incredibly, this is actually happening today as these gotcha notice provisions are becoming increasingly common in public works contracts across the state. While we look forward to working with you all on these positive bills, S6315, retainage reform, and S6906, the public works notice provision, which I just mentioned, have passed their respective Senate committees, and both are on the Senate floor calendar. We urge the full Senate to pass both of these important bills as quickly as possible so we may focus on them in the Assembly with just a few weeks left in this legislative session. Both general contractors and subcontractors face tremendous challenges doing business in New York. Excessive, duplicative, and burdensome regulations, costly insurance, surety bond requirements, frequently late or entirely denied payments, and unresolved change orders are all too often the norm. This drives up the cost of construction, making New York a far less competitive place to do business, which in turn negatively impacts the state economy. The problems we have discussed today are very real, and they are costing New York State both jobs and economic opportunity. But we also discussed some solutions in the form of remedial legislation that will help contractors and subcontractors get paid on time. It's really that simple. Our members just want to get paid within a reasonable period for the work that we do, so in turn we can pay our workers and our bills. Some of the legislation I mentioned today was just introduced and requires further discussions. However, others are bills that, to your credit, consistently pass the Senate but face opposition in the Assembly by organizations and entities that are unfairly taking advantage of the status quo. And a few other bills seem to stand a reasonable chance of passage in both houses this year. I would say let's all work together over the next few weeks by getting at least one of these beneficial bills signed into law. On behalf of the STA, thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I would be happy to answer any of your questions or engage in discussion.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And I you know what, I appreciate your comments, especially those you made at the end. All the subcontractors are asking is that they get paid on time. You know, at a time when we in New York and contractors in New York perhaps pay the highest workers' comp premiums in the country and perhaps pay the highest general liability premiums in the country. And that's just to turn on the lights before they actually put a boot on the ground and put a shovel in the ground on a project. The idea that we have to be here holding a hearing and having discussions on just the propriety of people being paid on time, that we would have to intervene and actually introduce legislation, seems incredibly bizarre. But here we are. The backdrop for all this, and I think it's important that we point this out, and I know you're certainly familiar with this. If a subcontractor fails to pay their employees, doesn't meet payroll, they can expect a visit from the Labor Department, right?
Absolutely.
And there's personal liability there. And if a subcontractor, if they happen to be a union shop, if they fail to pay their benefits pursuant to their collective bargaining agreements, they can expect a federal claim under ERISA,
Right.
again, with personal liability. Right. So all of that liability and all of that pressure is on the subcontractor who employed the labor and made those commitments and did the work. And so all we're looking for here, I would think, is the opportunity for those subcontractors to be paid. And if they're not being paid, that their invoices be properly responded to, and if they disagree, that they have an outlet where they can actually ask somebody to make a decision, an impartial third party. And so I appreciate the horror stories of contractors who have been forced, literally strangled out of business, because that's the reality.
Yeah. There's a core of my membership that have been in business for 40, 50 years, and in some cases, the business itself has been around for 100+ years. Many of those folks that been in the business for a while, I talk to them, and inevitably, it gets around to, would you want your son or daughter to be going into this business at this particular point? And more often than not, I hate to say, the answer is no. I want them to do something else. This is, the headaches and the misery that have become the norm in getting paid, especially working on a public side. Just have a lot of these long-term contractors, subcontractors, scratching their heads and saying, it's just becoming too much, and I wouldn't encourage my own kids to do this at this point. So it's I think that speaks volumes to how bad things have gotten over the last talking to these guys, it sounds like, things really started to turn 15, 20 years ago, in this regard. I don't know why, but, those seem to be the backdrop for some of these horror stories that one hears.
I agree, and the conversations I've had oftentimes involve people relaying that they don't feel it's ever been worse. And so these efforts, and I appreciate also, you're referencing all of those bills, because if there's one thing that we can hopefully try to do between now and the end of the year is try to package these into let's say a contractor's day, or a construction day, where we can put a bunch of bills on the agenda, or try to get a bunch of bills on and do it together, because maybe there's some momentum there, maybe there's an opportunity for a dialogue, and maybe there's an opportunity for our friends and colleagues in the Assembly to do the same thing.
From your lips to God's ears.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Next up, we have Michael Misenheimer, Executive Director, Empire State Subcontractors Association. Michael, welcome.
morning, Chairman Martins, Senator Savino. My name is Michael Meisenheimer. I am the Executive Director of the Empire State Subcontractors Association, representing approximately 1,000 commercial, industrial, and public works subcontractors, specialty contractors, and material supply firms statewide. ESSA is the largest statewide association of subcontractors in the country, and our members represent companies performing work in virtually all trade categories, from plumbing and HVAC to steel fabrication and erection to concrete and masonry. I very much appreciate the opportunity to present the views of the association to the committee on the issue of prompt payment in the construction industry, particularly as it relates to subcontractors. If there is a single goal that has defined the Empire State Subcontractors Association over its more than 40-year history, it is improving payment practices within the construction industry. Many of the achievements that have characterized the association are tied to ensuring that subcontractors get paid on time for work properly performed. Since 1975, ESSA has been at the forefront in advancing legislation to, among other things, improve subcontractors' lien protections and entitlement to payment. And yet the battle to improve payment practices in the construction industry continues, because delays in receiving payment persist as a major problem for subcontractors. Very simply, positive cash flow resulting from prompt payment represents the lifeblood of all subcontractors. Although they are generally the last parties on a construction project to be paid, subcontractors must still meet weekly payroll obligations and must pay suppliers promptly, whether or not they have received payment. Profit margins for most subcontractors are usually far too small to absorb payment delays for long. Typical impediments to prompt payment for subcontractors include contingent payment terms such as pay when paid provisions, excessive amounts of retainage withheld, the slow release of retainage, change order provisions which require the prompt performance of extra work with no guarantee of prompt processing and payment of those change orders, and owners prolonging the procedure for completing the punch list for many months or even years after substantial completion has been reached. I'd like to focus my remarks today on the issues of retainage and change orders. Retainage is generally characterized as a contractual arrangement whereby payment for a percentage of the value of completed work is withheld until a later date, usually project completion. In essence, retainage is money that has been earned, but payment is delayed until a later stage. Retainage held from a general contractor by a public or private owner typically cascades through the entire delivery chain to include project subcontractors and sometimes even suppliers. The practice is commonly perceived to provide a level of financial protection to the party withholding retainage, as well as an added incentive for proper and timely performance of the work. However, in an industry where profit margins are thin and cash management is essential, the withholding of retainage can create a significant financial strain on subcontractors. ESSA believes New York State's retainage policy should be reformed for a variety of reasons. Most notably, retainage seriously impairs subcontractor cash flow. To cover diminished cash flow caused by the withholding of retainage, subcontractors must either increase their bid price or borrow to replace needed working capital. A study by Clemson University in 2004 found that subcontractors boost their bids for projects with retainage requirements by 3.6% on average to cover the lost use of money during and after the project and lost opportunities due to reduced cash flow. This means the extra cost through the withholding of retainage on a $10 million construction project will be $360,000. Clearly a very expensive insurance policy for the owner. Because most projects include retainage, any retainage funded out of working capital effectively results in a complete withdrawal of this working capital from a subcontractor's business. Retainage essentially requires that subcontractors incur the expense of financing a portion of the project, and the practice has persisted, at least in part, because it remains a form of interest-free financing for the owner. Further, holding retainage far beyond the subcontractor's completion date may actually slow down the progress of work rather than assure progress by subcontractors. What incentive does a subcontractor have to return to a job site to complete punch list items if, in spite of completing its punch list, the subcontractor will not receive its retainage for many months or even years later. On the other hand, if a subcontractor is assured of receiving its retainage when its work is completed, rather than at the end of the entire project, that subcontractor has a financial incentive to promptly return to the job site to complete any outstanding punch list items. Retainage can be abused and is sometimes used as leverage by the owner to resolve claims for extra work. Some owners delay payment of retainage as a method to negotiate a reduction in the amount of final payment due. But it can get worse. We have seen some public owners withhold amounts in addition to retainage by requiring the contractor to assign a percent value to line items in the schedule of values for such items as project closeout, to be held until such time as the project is actually closed out. In other words, an additional amount of retainage by another name is withheld. This extra percentage is in addition to the 5 to 10% of normal retainage that is already being withheld by the owner. It is important to note that the vast majority of construction firms owned by minorities and women operate as subcontractors. Because many of these firms are new and emerging companies, the negative impacts of retainage are exacerbated for MWBE. Retainage causes construction projects in part to be financed from the bottom up. Therefore, the smallest and weakest firms, those with the least access to credit, bear the greatest financing burden. Reforming retainage provisions is not a concept new to the New York State Legislature. Indeed, the legislature recognized the problem that retainage poses for subcontractors in 2005 when it passed legislation that was later signed by Governor Pataki and which effectively eliminated retainage on DOT highway projects. The impetus for this measure came from the federal government, which in connection with state highway aid required the states to reform their payment procedures to improve cash flow and eliminate retainage for disadvantaged business enterprises. The federal government itself has long had a policy of withholding no retainage. The federal acquisition regulations state, if the federal contracting officer finds that satisfactory performance was achieved during any period for which a progress payment is to be made, the contracting officer shall authorize payment to be made in full. Simply, it is the policy of the federal government that retainage should not be used as a substitute for good contract management. Many states have and continue to move toward retainage reform. When New York State's payment retainage law for public projects was enacted back in 1978, it represented a breakthrough for the state's construction industry. Not only did this law prescribe payment mechanisms for public work contracts, it also stipulated the percentage of retainage that may be withheld from contractors and subcontractors performing work for state agencies, municipalities, and school districts throughout New York State. These new retainage provisions essentially limited retainage to a maximum of 5% when performance and payment bonds are required and 10% when bonds are not required. The law also required public entities to release retainage upon substantial completion of the project, less an amount to cover the punch list and any outstanding claims, liens, and judgments. At the time, New York's payment retainage law was considered to be cutting edge and a significant change for the better. This is no longer the case. In more recent years, state after state have recognized the problems caused by retainage and have taken steps to reduce retainage permitted on public and, in some cases, private projects. For example, in New Jersey, the amount of retainage specified on most public construction projects is just 2%. Many other states reduce or eliminate retainage at 50% of project completion, or place withheld funds in interest-bearing accounts for the benefit of contractors and subcontractors. Several states, including North Carolina, authorized the early release of retainage to subcontractors who have satisfactorily completed their work. The North Carolina law declares that when a project is 50% complete, early finishing trades may seek a 100% retainage payment contingent upon approval of the project architect or engineer. In New Mexico, retainage is actually prohibited on the majority of public projects. In Massachusetts, legislation was enacted just 2 years ago, which limits the amount of retainage that can be withheld by private owners to no more than 5%. As you can see, New York's 1978 payment retainage law is now severely outdated and lags behind most of the other states. There are currently 2 retainage-related bills that have been introduced in the New York State Legislature by Senator DeFrancisco and Assemblyman Cusick, which would have a significant positive impact on payment to subcontractors. Senate 2924 and Assembly 4266 would require the release of retainage to each subcontractor no later than 60 days from the completion and acceptance by the public owner of that subcontractor's work. This legislation would significantly improve subcontractors' cash flow by requiring the release of retainage within a reasonable period of time after each subcontractor completes its work, and would be particularly beneficial to the early finishing subcontractors performing activities such as site work, excavation, and steel erection. Early finishing subcontractors often have to wait many months and often years before their retainage is released to them. Senate 6315, Assembly 9868 would define substantial completion on public work contracts and would prescribe timelines and procedures to be followed by public owners and contractors with respect to the punch list once substantial completion has been reached. More specifically, the legislation would require public owners to submit in writing to the contractor a complete list of all remaining items to be completed by the contractor within 14 days after the project has reached substantial completion. It would similarly require the contractors to submit the punch list to each subcontractor within 7 days after receiving the punch list from the owner. Currently, some public owners prolong the procedure for completing the punch list for many months or even years, to the point where the punch list begins to look more like routine maintenance not contemplated under the original contract. This legislation would require the punch list to be dealt with expeditiously, thereby allowing all remaining retainage withheld by the owner to be released to the contractor and subcontractors as quickly as possible. These 2 bills represent new approaches to getting funds that have been previously earned but not paid into the coffers of contractors and subcontractors on a much more prompt basis than is currently the case. ESSA urges legislative support for both of these bills. Now, just a few comments on change orders. Contract provisions covering change orders and extras have also been of special concern to subcontractors. However, they have become more significant with the increased use of design, build, and fast-track methods of construction. The number and complexity of changes and extras multiply when design details are modified as the work progresses. Most contracts, including public contracts, require the contractor or subcontractor to provide notice of change within a certain number of days or the claim will be barred. Public contracts also require the contractor or subcontractor to submit a cost proposal within a specified and usually short period of time. On the other hand, very few contracts require the owner to process the cost proposal or issue a change order within any specific number of days. It is also not unusual for owners to use change directives to demand that work be performed by a contractor or a subcontractor before reaching agreement as to whether the work exceeds the contract scope or before the basis or amount of additional compensation is agreed upon. As a result, contractors and subcontractors are forced to perform the changed work, incur the additional costs, and refrain from even requesting payment for that work until a formal change order has been issued. This can be a serious problem if an owner elects to demand extra work routinely through the use of change directives rather than change orders. Since there is no limitation of when resolution of the amount of adjustment may be reached, and the owner has no real incentive to negotiate fair change amounts promptly, payment delays are often lengthy. At the same time, contractors and subcontractors lose the leverage necessary to negotiate fair adjustments in price by having to wait until the work has already been completed before reaching an agreement with the owner. Many members of ESSA have expressed concern about lengthy delays in the processing and payment of change orders by New York State public agencies, often taking 4 to 6 months or longer. In addition, we've heard concerns expressed about change orders being issued whereby the scope of work is either vague or doesn't conform closely to the actual work being performed by the contractor or subcontractor. Further, when there is a dispute as to the cost of extra work, the contractor or subcontractor is required to perform the extra work but has no mechanism for invoicing for at least a percentage of the cost pending the resolution of the dispute. ESSA believes a number of actions can be taken by public agencies to accelerate the processing and payment of change orders to contractors and subcontractors, such as require public agencies to either approve or disapprove the contractor's cost proposal no later than 30 days from the date submitted by the contractor. If the public agency fails to approve or disapprove the contractor's cost proposal within a 30-day requirement, the contractor's cost proposal shall be deemed accepted by the public agency. Require public agencies and contractors to quickly resolve the scope of work to be performed under the change order. If there is a dispute as to the cost of the change order, allow the contractor to invoice for 50% of the contractor's estimated cost to perform the work pending resolution of the disputed amount. Include a contingency allowance in public contracts to allow public agencies to expeditiously process and make payment on small changes without the necessity of going through the formal change order procedure. The Empire State Subcontractors Association has worked for more than 40 years to promote strong prompt payment laws and practices with the New York State's construction industry. The foregoing provides our recommendations for approving payment to contractors and subcontractors through reform of New York's retainage laws